Today we're out here in Iceland with the Sony A7R Mark V you can get on Adorama. Today we're talking about why the Sony A7R Mark V is an incredible camera for wedding photography for a variety of different reasons, and I'm going to be getting into all of them in no particular order. Number one, the lenses available for the Sony Alpha system. You have a variety of third-party lenses. My favorites currently being the Tamron 35-150 f2 to f2.8, this 35mm f1.4 GM, the 20mm f1.8, the 50mm f1.4, and the 85mm f1.8. Not the 1.4. And in this Adorama series, I'm going to be making videos about all of these lenses. Number two, I love the fact that it's a very high megapixel camera. Typically, you don't need a 60 plus megapixel camera for wedding photography, but where it does come in handy, I'll actually set the C2 button right up there to APS-C crop mode. So when I hit that, I go from full frame into APS-C crop, so 1.5 times. So if I'm shooting a 35mm lens, all of a sudden I'm shooting something that's pretty close to a 50mm lens, and you're saving yourself time in post for cropping that. And I think it's important in wedding photography to get the image as close as you possibly can to the final image in camera. Even if you're using something like Imagen to do AI editing, the closer you can get the file, especially with crop, the better an AI system will be able to interpret what you're trying to do. Or if you're editing it yourself, you're just saving yourself cropping in post-production. Out of scope of this video, I also do a lot of hybrid photo video coverage, and it's very, very nice on any of the Sony cameras to set that up. So if you're shooting a prime lens and you're doing video, that you can bump into an APS-C crop mode and you get a little bit closer without actually moving your feet. Sometimes you're able to just walk up and that's totally fine. You get to use the full lens in full frame mode. But sometimes you're limited during a ceremony if you're on that Tamron 35-150 and you get to the end of that zoom range, you just need a little bit more. To be able to bump into APS-C is very, very beneficial. Next up, the ergonomics of this. So there's three wheels up here, and I like that a lot. So there's the one on your front, the one on the back, which most camera systems have. But then there's this third one right here. This used to be the exposure compensation wheel, but you can map it to ISO, and it's an infinite spin. So you're just able to run your ISO on this dial, and you can also lock it. If you're shooting aperture priority with auto ISO, maybe this isn't important. For me doing hybrid photo video, I think it's important to shoot in manual video mode so that I'm not getting weird exposure changes, because it's usually a white dress that I'm photographing, and as that becomes closer and more of the frame, an aperture priority mode would start to compensate for that by making the frame a little bit darker overall, and I want to have full control over that. Next up, 2 card slots, and both photography and video files right to both of those card slots, which is very, very important for me. Next up, maybe this one should have come at the beginning, the autofocus. The autofocus in this is amazing. There's a new AI chip or pipeline in here that basically will understand what people are, even if they're not facing the screen. So right now, face and eye detect is working fine because my face is on the screen. But if I was to turn away, it would know that, hey, that's a human shoulder, and it will actually prioritize body parts by importance. So it knows the head is important, it knows an elbow, maybe not so important. So if it has its choice between the side of a head and an elbow that's a little bit closer to the screen, it's gonna choose the head. And while my Sony A7 IV was really, really good at autofocus, the A7R Mark V is even better. Next, we have the screen. So this is personal preference. I love to have a fully articulating screen that I can actually I would say shoot 95% of the day with the screen out like this. I'm very, very rarely through the viewfinder. I will say that I'll probably go multiple wedding days just using the screen only. This is a product of when we were wearing masks. And if you're actually taking pictures and you had a mask, you fog up your viewfinder. So I started doing this and I kind of really like it. I obviously like it for video, but then I also started really enjoying it for photography to just see the final image that you're taking in less of an immersive environment, which might be counterintuitive. I kind of like it better.
Want to have a real wedding?
Oh God! Yes?
Yeah. Want to get married?
Yes. I don't know. I think it goes on that one.
Now for how I actually run my autofocus settings on this camera, I will do full wide all points. So I'm not, my friend Magic uses tracking. So I think that's maybe more common for people coming up on Sony. You use a tracking point and you put that over the person and you track them and it tracks their face and it's great. I just use all points. So I'm using every single point in wide mode. And what I'm doing is I'll actually, if it doesn't select, so if there's 3 people in the scene, I'm not writing anything. You can do facial recognition. You can like write a bunch of images of, if you're photographing a couple, put them as priorities in the frames. I don't do that. What I will do is if it selects the incorrect person, I will just frame the other people out and drag it back. And when you're half pressing, it will stay on that person that it locked on. Or I will just touch the back of the screen here to enable tracking on the person that I want it to track. And I'm on autofocus continuous and I've never had any problems with this camera. Now, outside of wedding photography, we probably also do a lot of other things with our cameras that aren't just specific to weddings. I find that this camera is the most scalable outside of weddings of any of the Sony Alpha cameras available right now. When it comes to doing commercial, either photography or video or self-filming, a big thing for me is this front-facing screen, so I'm able to actually set up shots and just see what I'm doing here. That is very, very helpful and needed for what I do. The video files, when you're shooting S-Cinetone, it's just incredible. You don't have to shoot a log format. You can, obviously, if you want, but I will just be shooting S-Cinetone, and I love the way that it just kind of, it saves you a little bit, that if things get a little bit too bright and they might be about to clip, it'll kind of hold them back for you for a little bit, and it makes a flatter profile, and from there I'll actually add my clean LUT to it. And that's the look that I like the best, and it is super simple and easy to achieve. When it comes to those auto exposure modes, this camera has gotten a lot better. I will still usually lock out my white balance. The white balance, the auto white balance is a lot better in this camera, but I would still prefer to be on shade mode and take some of the guesswork away from the camera. I prefer shade white balance simply because most of the time I'm gonna say my couple's faces are in the shade. So they're either in open shade and they're covered, or if we're doing something in the bright sun, usually they are faced away from the sun and their face is still in the shade. So what I'm doing is I'm white balancing for the skin tone rather than the full scene. So sometimes my images will be a little bit too warm, I'll have to cool them down in post, but overall I would say that that makes me pretty happy with the image that I'm seeing on the back of the screen. Another helpful tip for hybrid shooters, it took me a minute to find in the menu system. It is possible to disconnect if you're using Cinetone for video. Usually you'll set that one picture profile, PP11, and it will do everything from photography and video. There is a way in the menu system to disconnect that. So you can shoot standard profile or whatever you want in photography. And when you go into video mode, you'll be shooting in Cinetone. So your images, if you're shooting Cinetone in video, your images aren't gonna be gray and a little bit weird looking, they could just be completely normal. Another thing is battery life is really, really great. I think for a long time, mirrorless kind of got the rep of just not really having great battery life. And I will say I can get through pretty much an entire day of photo and video coverage on one battery most of the time. I'm rarely changing batteries, which is kind of crazy. If you are doing hybrid coverage with this, one of the negatives is that the buffer is a little bit slower. So you have to have really fast cards in here if you want to be changing from photo to video mode. It is possible, but it is a little bit slower than my Sony A7RV. So that is definitely something to consider if you are a hybrid shooter, because it will slow you down in certain situations. And there it is, the Sony A7R Mark V for wedding photographers and a little bit of hybrid video creation in there as well. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'm happy to get back to you. And don't forget to head on over to Adorama if you are interested in picking one of these up, this 35mm f1.4 GM, or any of the other lenses that I've mentioned in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.